Hey folks, and welcome back. My name is Daniel, and today, as promised in my last video, I'm going to be diving into a craft project. Now, I picked up this for $5 at my local dollar store, and I don't know how good a bird feeder it would be, but I think it's going to be a pretty cool wizard tower. I've got a few ideas for that, some things I've never tried before, and I'm pretty excited to get started. So let's just jump in. First thing is first, since I already have an idea of what I want, I go through some beads and bits boxes and get out a few trinkets that might help. That includes finding an old 3D printed door that I never used that would be perfect for this project. I want to build out the bottom of the tower to make it look like the entire structure is built out of the side of a natural rock formation, so where I put the door doesn't matter. But I do want to offset the window to one side, so I mark where I want the door to go and then get out a rotary tool to take all of the excess material off of the door, since this isn't what it was originally printed for. If you're going to do something like this, you definitely want to wear a mask, by the way. You do not want to be breathing in resin dust. The plan is to use foam scraps to build out the bottom of the tower and then blend it into the bricks on the upper half with Sculptamold. I start by drawing a rough outline of where I want the natural rocks to end up on the tower. I don't plan to follow this strictly, it's just to give me a rough idea while I build. I get out some old foam pieces that are left over from projects and just start milling them down into random bits and pieces. This is going to seem haphazard and sloppy, and that's kind of because it is. All I'm trying to do at this point is get the rough shapes that I want to build out the bottom of the tower. I use the hot wire to give them a rocky sort of shape with a lot of random odd angled cuts. But don't worry, it's going to get more texture later on. My tool of choice for attaching the foam is hot glue. When you're using a hot glue gun with foam, you do have to be careful not to melt it. Use a low temperature setting if you have one. On this particular project though, a little melted foam isn't the end of the world. We haven't textured anything yet anyway. Right now I'm just taking random foam pieces and gluing them on to give me roughly the shape that I'm going to want for the finished tower. I also glued the door on during this part so that I could build a kind of a rocky door frame around it. I'd love to be able to say that there was some method to my madness here, but there just isn't. And there doesn't need to be. This is just bulking out the tower and using up random foam scraps, which is a beautiful thing. And I ended up with it looking like this. Alright, I know what you're thinking. It's finally happened. That looks terrible. He's completely lost the plot. He started a video with no idea how to build what he wants to build, with no idea what he's doing. The joke's on you. That's all of my videos. I never know what I'm doing. Plus, there's still a good 80% chance that this turns out looking great. 70% chance. Solid 32% chance that this turns out looking great. Alright, enough playing around. I get my Olfa knife out next and start hacking out a few random pieces and carving off any parts that I don't like the look of, just to start bringing this more in line with a rocky cliff face. The next step is to fill in the trench carved in the side of the birdhouse. I'm just going to use hot glue for that and smooth it out with my finger. Though, like the name implies, it is hot glue, so I did dip my finger in paint water first to protect it. With the gap filled, naturally the next step is to texture the foam with a rolled up ball of tinfoil. Normally, you want to texture foam before you glue it in place, but in this case, it just wasn't possible. I'm actually going to be filling in all of these gaps in the foam later on anyway, so it's not a big deal this time if some parts remain untextured. As you can see, we're already getting closer to a more acceptable stone texture. For the bricks on the top half of the tower, I'm opting to use egg carton instead of foam. There are a few reasons for this. For one, I love the texture. For another, it's going to help differentiate the raw stone from the worked bricks. And thirdly, it's cheap and readily available, and I love that. And finally, laying down 1,000 little foam bricks just isn't a good use of my time. It's not fun. And in this case, it wouldn't really look better either. Sometimes the cheaper, easier solution really is the way to go. So the egg carton gets cut into random bricks, and the bricks just get arranged and glued on with tacky glue. Using tacky glue instead of hot glue will give you a little bit of extra time to adjust the brick positioning once it's on the side of the tower. I try to be somewhat consistent with the amount of space I leave between bricks, but it's not all that important as long as it's not wildly different. Okay, now it's time for the good stuff, the part of the project that's finally going to start pulling things together and making me look at least a little bit like I know what I'm doing. Sculpt-A-Mold. For those of you not familiar, Sculpt-A-Mold is basically an advanced version of paper mache with more texture. You can mix it with water until it's thin enough that you can mold it with your fingers, but you still want it thick enough that it's not runny. Because it can be diluted with water, that also means that once you start sculpting with it, you can use additional water to blend one texture into another. So that's exactly what I do here. I start using it to fill the gaps in all of the rocks, but also smooth the transition of rock into brick. Sculpt-A-Mold can actually be sanded if you want once it's dry, but it has a very natural rocky texture of its own, which makes it perfect for this. To smooth out the places where it turns from stone to brick, I just wet my finger and feather it over the Sculpt-A-Mold, drawing it out in thin layers over the bricks. It does take some time to fill in all of those gaps and to smooth all of the transitions, but I promise it's worth it. Here's how it looks when the Sculpt-A-Mold is finally dry. Now with renewed faith that I'm not going to have to title this video, "Watch me screw up a wizard tower build," I move on to adding Mod Podge mixed with black paint. I could probably just base coat the whole thing in black craft paint, but since this is made of so many different pieces of foam and egg carton and everything else, an extra layer of glue over everything seems like a good idea. This is also my favorite part of a build. Putting that first layer of black paint on is always what makes it look like one object instead of a bunch of pieces you've just glued together. It's really the point that lets you imagine how it's going to look when it's all done, and when you can stop worrying about whether it's going to turn out. While I get that done, I'd like to take a second to thank everyone for watching, but also to give a special thanks to my Patreon supporters, especially my Terrain tier supporter, Amanda Chisholm. Thank you so much for your continued support. It really makes a world of difference, and it's a huge encouragement in keeping the channel going. If any of you want to support the channel, hitting like and subscribe or sharing the video with friends or crafting groups is a great first step. If you'd like to do more than that though, and go the extra mile, there are links below to Patreon and to buymeacoffee.com. The Patreon has a Discord as well as some exclusive content for you to check out, and any support is hugely appreciated. With the Mod Podge dry, it's time to slap down some base coats. I mix burnt umber with a medium gray, and that goes over absolutely everything except the front door and the roof. The idea here is just to get a basic earth tone over everything as an undercoat. We're going to be covering up 95% of this later on, but this way, if we miss a spot or the paint gets scratched or something like that, there's a nice black-brown earth tone there anyway. To differentiate the bricks from the stone and to add a little more color to things, I add some red into the burnt umber and gray mix I've already made, and I use that to base coat the bricks. Now this may look just kind of out there right now, but the dry brushing and the washes later are going to knock this down to basically being just an interesting shadow color instead. Now it's time for dry brushing. I take a medium gray and do a heavy dry brush over everything we've painted so far. There's no need to be shy, I'm basically overbrushing the entire project. This should cover up the majority of the brown and the red and bring those colors closer together. It shifts everything to be a little brighter as well. Again, the only thing I skip is the front door and the roof. We'll take care of those a little later. Once the first dry brush is done, I do it again. I move up to a light gray and I dry brush all over those areas again, being just a little gentler and applying just a little less paint. This is less of an overbrush and more of a proper dry brush this time. It's finally time to start painting the door. I've picked a bright red to give it some pop and just roughly fill in all of the areas between the metal straps. Being messy is fine here since all of those metal bits are going to be painted too. When the base coat is dry, I take a brighter red and just stipple it into the center of each panel randomly to add texture. Again, you don't have to worry about being neat yet. I've decided on a bronze for all of the metals to bring a little warmth to all of this cold gray stone. I pick out all of the metal girding on the door, the knocker, and basically everything else. I do try to be more careful here just to avoid having to touch up the red. It's not difficult to do though if you have to. The roof of the wizard tower gets painted out in a similar bronze. Because I'm using a craft paint for this part, it will take multiple layers to become opaque. Craft paint metallics are pretty weak in comparison to miniature paints, but when you're covering this much space, using mini paints just doesn't make sense, so that's fine. Just put on multiple layers, letting each one dry completely before moving on to the next. There's no texture that we're trying to preserve on the rooftop, so it doesn't really matter if the paint is thick. Finally, it's time for a wash. This is a homemade black wash using black acrylic paint, water, and dish soap. Putting this on is going to shade things, knock all of our highlights down a step, and help to unify the entire paint scheme. This can be applied pretty heavily, and you want to keep your brush moving as you do, making sure it gets into all of the crevices. Keep an eye on things to make sure it's not pooling anywhere that you don't want, and remember, it's going to dry to look much less dramatic than it does right now. I know this step can be daunting if you're new to all of this, but I promise it adds a lot of dimension to everything you've already done. If you're new to crafting, then this is one of those skills you definitely want to master and get comfortable with as soon as possible, as it's one of the easiest, cheapest ways to improve the look of your project. In fact, once the black wash is dry, I come in with a green wash and do the exact same thing, though only about a third of the way up the tower. I want to add a bit of color and life to the rocks and make them look like they've been outdoors. This is the start of that, adding a bit of algae or moss and further separating the natural stone from the bricks. To further weather the tower, I take a verdigris paint and dot it onto the door and the rooftop, basically just running it anywhere that water might collect over time and cause the bronze to verdigris. This adds age and weather to the appearance, as well as adding another pop of bright color. And speaking of adding color and interest, I found a few lovely blue beads in my collection and decided to add them to the strange rooftop decorations on the tower. I'm not sure what they're for exactly, I'm no wizard, but they add shape and color, and they make the rooftop look more intentional, and that's enough for me. I'm coming into the home stretch now, just adding the last few touches, the things that are really going to make the build pop and feel complete. In this case, that means adding some algae and some tufts. The algae is simple grass flock mixed with PVA glue and kind of clumped on anywhere that I thought would look good. This is a good complement to amp up the effect of the green wash that we already did. And like the grass and flower tufts that I'm going to add in a moment, it will also make the natural rock parts of the tower seem more aged and colorful, really emphasizing that it's a man-made structure built into a natural environment. The grass and flower tufts get dipped in tacky glue and pushed into crevices that look like plants might grow through, and just dotted around the tower in general. with that final step done, here's how my $5 birdhouse wizard tower ended up looking. I have to admit, I love how this finished product looks. I think it definitely sells the idea of a wizard tower, and I love the contrast between the natural and man-made aspects. It almost has kind of a lighthouse vibe to me, with a big tower coming out of the rocks like that, but that's cool too. Maybe it belongs to some mages that live by the sea. Some wizards of the coast, if you will. You didn't really think we were going to get through a whole video without a dad joke, did you? Alright folks, if you liked this one, please hit like and subscribe, and let me know in the comments what you think of the build. I'm considering maybe picking up a couple more towers to make some guard houses, or even a gatehouse. Let me know if you'd like to see that in a future video. Until then, thank you for watching, take care, and I'll see you on the next one.